Hey, welcome to the Writing Well office hours. It's just me this week. Um, I'm going to go into more detail about um, one of the topics we sort of touched on last week in office hours. So I'm going to talk about structure, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of editing, in the context of planning your story, and how you can use it to make the writing happen faster without necessarily losing the chance to build your voice by practicing writing rough draft repeatedly. um, so to start, let's recap what structural editing or developmental editing is. The terms are interchangeable. Sometimes some people use one, sometimes they use the other. It doesn't really matter what you call it. Um, I like I like to use structural editing better because I'm an engineer, and when I think of building something, it has a structure and it has a function and it has a shape that you put on top of the structure to make the function easier to understand and make it easier to use. Um, so when I think of the bones of something, I think of structure. Um, so the purpose of structural editing is to figure out if the story that you have is complete. Does it have a full arc to it? Does it have a beginning? Does it have a middle? Does it have an end? Do those pieces fit together in a way that makes sense? It doesn't matter if your reader is in the middle and is confused. It matters if they finish the book and they close it and they're still confused, then something's missing. And so I like to think about structure in terms of the story star that I mentioned last time, and I have the the star open. So I'm going to screen share so you can see the star. Okay, so the star has five points, obviously, um, and and the first point, the one down at the lower left, is your inciting incident. And if you're thinking about beginning, middle, end, then this point is the bulk of your beginning. The bulk of your beginning is this inciting incident. It's whatever it is that causes your main character to go on their journey. It's whatever causes them to want to change as a person. Um, if you're writing something that's more internal, more literary, um, it's whatever it is that happens that gets everything started. And then you move on to the second point, the left middle point. Um, and that point is your inciting incident. Uh, no, I'm sorry, I'm scatterbrained today. You start off at the lower left with your inciting incident, and you move up to your complication. That's that point on the um, sort of upper left. Um, and your complication is when you're thinking about beginning, middle, end, your complication is what transitions you from the beginning to the middle. And if you're doing it in a 5-act structure instead of a 3-act structure, so the 3-act structure is beginning, middle, end, and the 5-act structure is this story star where each piece corresponds to one of these 5 points. Um, so, so your complication is is really when you realize that your inciting incident, the problem you have to solve, the problem that you start exploring, that you discover in the inciting incident, is not going to be as straightforward to solve as you thought. Maybe you wake up and you decide you want to eat eggs for breakfast. That's your inciting incident, is that you wake up in the morning and you want some scrambled eggs. And then your complication is that you don't have any eggs, right? So So it goes from being a simple matter of taking the eggs and making an omelet or scrambling them or whatever to suddenly you need to find some eggs or you have to change your mind about what you're going to eat. Um, and then this point on the top is your crisis. This is where you're facing an impossible choice. This is the entire bulk of the middle. And if you're doing a traditional like hero's journey style novel, then this crisis is going to be something that's longer, it's drawn out, it's cyclical, where you have your main character knows they have to do something, but they keep changing their mind on how to do it, or what they try isn't working because they don't have all of the pieces yet. So they're trying to solve the problem and they're not getting quite there. Um, it's a crisis. um, yeah. So this is the bulk of the middle if you're doing a 3 act. And then the point on the upper right is your climax. This is where you have your final battle in a typical fantasy novel. You have, you know, you've made the decision to go to the grocery store to buy eggs, and you're at the grocery store and you've chosen your eggs and you're on your way to pay for them. In my little breakfast drama example. Um, this is where you transition from the middle to the end. Um, if you're doing the beginning, middle, end structure, the 3 act structure. And then this final point on the lower right is your resolution. You've got your eggs, you're home, you're making your omelet, and you're happy. Um, you defeated the bad guy if you're doing a fantasy novel. You've grown as a person, you've come to accept whatever it was that you needed to change about yourself if you're a character in a more literary novel. Um, and I really like this framework, and I like thinking about it as a story star because whenever I have any story that works, I get a gold star for it. And that is a very fun little reward that I like. It keeps me motivated, it keeps me excited about what I'm writing about, even when I'm frustrated. And the nice thing about this too is, these are nesting. These stars nest. So if you have your inciting incident at the beginning of your story, and you're looking at a scene in there in your inciting incident, then that scene is going to have a complete story start in it. So every time you write a scene, you get a mini gold star. Um, so the beginning has a beginning, a middle, and an end within it. It has these 5 points within it. Um, and then you can have a bigger story star that covers the beginning to the end of your entire series if you're writing a series. Um, so it's fun to think about how these pieces all fit together, and you can, when you've written something and you're going back to check it, then you're doing your structural editing, and you're thinking about how each piece, each paragraph, each scene, each chapter fits in to all of the different story stars that are within that piece. Whether it's, the complete story star of the paragraph, the complete story star of the scene, or whether it's, does that paragraph have to do with the beginning of the scene? So is that paragraph about the inciting incident of the scene as well as being its own little story star? Um, and usually when you're writing, you don't want to think about it in so much structure, so much rigidity, but when you're going back and reviewing, it's really helpful to make sure, it's a check. Does it work? Does it not work? Um, and I like to use this while I'm planning out my stories, actually. I find it much more efficient to do the structural editing before I've written my first draft, because that reduces the amount of rewriting I need to do. So I start out with a storyboard, and I'll explain a little bit about how I do my storyboard in a minute. I first want to show you the fact funnel, because this is going to make it a little bit easier for you to understand how I apply the star to a storyboard where I have more than 5 pieces. Um, so here we have a fact funnel. And the fact funnel and the story star are the same thing. They just look different because they're different shapes. And I call this the fact funnel because it's the stereotypical structure that you probably learned in your high school English class when you were writing essays about, To Kill a Mockingbird. um, so the triangle at the top is your introduction. And you're going from general everything that could possibly be important to your topic sentence. So this is why this shape I have little lines so that you can write out your main thesis statement, your main argument for the entire essay. You can write out the topics for each paragraph and your main conclusion. So if you're writing an article where you're trying to persuade someone to come around to your point of view, this is a really great structure to use. But it's the same as the story star, because in your introduction, you have some inciting incident, and that inciting incident is why your argument, your thesis is important. Why should I care about whether or not eating eggs for breakfast is good for me? That's your inciting incident, is the reason why I should care. And then your complication is your actual thesis statement. You should care that eggs are good for you. You should believe that eggs are good for you in the morning for breakfast, because they've got protein and they've got um, all sorts of nutrients that help you have high brain function so that you can focus and do whatever it is you need to do during the day. And I'm just making up this example for consistency, but you know, you have something that you want to convince people of, and that's your complication, is the transition in between the end of your introduction, the end of your inciting incident, into your main argument, which is your crisis. And again, this is where you get into those cyclical pieces of the middle, because each paragraph in an argumentative essay has one main point, one reason that you're proving using facts and figures and quotes and all sorts of things like that. Each paragraph is one piece of the puzzle. In the same way that if you're doing a novel, each time your hero tries and fails to accomplish their goal, they learn something and they get closer to actually winning and beating the bad guy, because they need to go through each of these cycles to learn something new each time. Um, and then there's transitions in between. So each of these paragraphs has its own story star within it. Each of these moments, each of these cycles within the crisis has its own story star within it. And then, the beginning of your conclusion, this triangle down at the bottom, that first sentence of your conclusion is a reframing of that thesis statement, right? It's your conclusion. So now that you've read all of my arguments about why eggs for breakfast is good for you, this is, eggs for breakfast is good for you. That's your conclusion. That's your main point of your conclusion. And that's the climax. So your climax and your complication reflect each other in the same way that your conclusion, the bulk of your conclusion after you've stated your climax, your concluding statement, is expanding on that statement and saying why, why that's relevant in broader terms. That's your resolution. You're tying it all up and you're putting it in a neat little package. And so to go back to the story star for a minute, this is a star, a 5-pointed star has a point of reflection, a line of reflection that goes straight from the center of the top to the center of the bottom. And you'll notice that the inciting incident and your resolution mirror each other, and your complication and your crisis mirror each other. And that's another good way to check whether your story works, whether it's an argument you're making in an essay, or it's a hero's journey where you have someone who starts out at home and something happens and they have to go defeat a bad guy, and then they have to come home again because they didn't want to leave home in the first place. So they've come back home at the end in the resolution, but things are different. So if you think about it, let's think about the Lord of the Rings for a minute. At the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo is home and he's happy and he doesn't want to move. He doesn't want to leave. Everything's great. And then stuff happens. Gandalf shows up. He has to, Frodo has to go on this epic journey. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo ends up back at home. But everything is different now because he's changed and he's had all of these experiences. So he's home, he enjoys being home, but it isn't the same. So it's almost like more of a spiral than an actual circle, if you think about it. That's why in the story star, I don't have an arrow connecting the bottom 2 points, because the bottom point of this story star doesn't lead to the beginning of this story star. The bottom point of this story star leads to the beginning point of a new story star. So for The Lord of the Rings, you have Frodo at the end. He's not happy. He's not feeling like his home is his home anymore because so much has changed for him. And so he starts on another journey, and that decision to start on that other journey is the first step in the story star that we don't get to read about, really. All we know is that he goes off on this journey, and it's a metaphor for, going off, dying, going into paradise. And so it makes sense that we don't get to see that story star, because there's a certain element of wonder and mystery to that process, right? So the way that I do my storyboarding, which is, I'm a visual person, so I prefer to do a storyboard rather than an outline, because it lets me see all of the pieces next to each other. It's not a list, it's a set of boxes. So the way that storyboarding works for animation videos or for film is they make little boxes and they draw a picture in each one. And it almost looks a lot like a comic strip. And in a lot of ways, comic strips can be thought up as a storyboard. For me, I write the caption with a line under it, and then in the little box, I write words, and they're phrases. They're not complete sentences that tell me what needs to happen, what the major event of that piece is. So if I'm writing a serial, I have a storyboard for each of the main characters, and I have one little box for each episode of the season of the serial. And I write a few words, Here's an example for the first episode of Sorceress and Beastly for Viola. I have episode 1, and then there's a line, and then I say, runs away, gets stuck, meets Kirill and Kylie, runs from wolves. And so much more than that happens to her. It's so much more complicated, but it gives me a starting point. So what I do is I fill out each episode like that. I put a few words, enough so that I know what what major thing needs to happen. It gives me enough information that I know what the climax needs to be so that I can fill in the rest of it later. And then what I do is I look at that whole storyboard and I check it. Does it fit with the story star? Do I have a complete story star from the beginning of the storyboard to the end of the storyboard? And if not, then I fix it right then and there before I go into any more depth, because I want to make sure that each piece fits and works before I start writing, because for me, the rough draft is it's the most time consuming, and it's the longest, and it's the part that I have the most trouble getting myself to sit down and do. So I want to make sure that when I do sit down and do it, I'm going to get as much done in the time that I have as possible. So I make sure that my structure works when I have a storyboard. And then I go through and I do my version of something a lot of people call beats. And if you listen to the self-publishing podcast, you've heard them talk about beats a lot. They do beats in a much more detailed way than I do. But I go through for each box of my storyboard, I go through and I write out a sentence for each piece within that box. So for a serial, I'm writing a sentence that describes the major thing that needs to happen in each scene within that episode. If I'm doing a novel, it's a little bit more complicated because my storyboard will be all of the scenes within the book. And so then I will go through and be a little bit more detailed in writing out, what the motivations for the characters are within that scene, and how they move from the beginning of the scene to the end of the scene. So my storyboards for my novels are more complicated and more involved than my storyboards for my serials, because in a way my serials are, each season is sort of like a book, but with a cliffhanger at the ending. There's not as firm a line between the resolution of season 1 and the inciting incident of season 2 in a serial. There's either a very sharp cliffhanger where you get left at the climax and you don't have a resolution, or the inciting incident for the next season has already happened, but the resolution hasn't finished yet. So there's a little bit of a different strategy for that. So storyboarding and beats and outlining are all different ways of putting together this structure in a way that you can check and you can do your structural editing before you've started to write your draft. And it's really helpful. I find it really helpful as a guide. So I don't always stick to exactly what I've said I was going to do in my storyboard, in my beats, but I use it as a guide, and I don't write in order. So this is really helpful to double check later and to make sure that I'm not missing any pieces. I know that my storyboard contains all of the pieces, and I can deviate from that so long as I come back. It's I like Charlene's analogy between the writing process and meditation, because when I stray from this structure I've put together for myself, I always have to come back to it. And that's just like when you're meditating and you start thinking about something and you notice that you're thinking about something, you come back to remembering to breathe in and out and to focus on your breath. So it's a lot like that, where you're letting yourself have the freedom to do what comes up, to write what comes up as it comes up, and then you bring it back to your main your main thread that's pulling you through from the beginning to the end as you go along. And in a lot of ways, this lets you stay focused so that when you're writing that first draft, you don't have as many pieces where you're writing and you've gone down a rabbit hole and you have to come back up. And sometimes it works to keep that in, and sometimes you just have to cut it out. So for me, having my structure already edited and developed before I do my writing, it helps me minimize how many rewrites I need to do because I'm not going down as many holes, rabbit holes. And at the same time, when you're starting out as a writer and you don't have that experience of writing a lot of words of narrative, and really the only way to figure out what your voice is, your style of writing, is to do the writing. I had to learn this the hard way when I was writing English essays in high school. It was a painful nightmare of 30 hours in order to get out about 1,000 words to maybe 2,000 words, depending. But I ended up having to write twice as much as that. I had to write at least 5,000 words before I could be done with my 1,500 word essay, because I didn't know, even following a structure, I didn't know what I really wanted to write about until I was done writing. And none of it made sense to anyone else until I was done moving all the pieces around and making it actually make sense. So when you have a structure to start from, it gives you a place where you can practice doing that narrative. You can take a scene and you can write it, and then you can save your draft from writing that scene when you're done, and you can put it in a different file and you can start over. And you're not editing here, you're completely rewriting. You're pretending you didn't write it the first time. You're writing it over a second time. And that lets you practice how you put words together, how you put sentences together, how you put paragraphs together. And then once you've gotten your version 1 and your version 2, you can compare them and you can pick and choose the parts that work best from each version and put that into a whole that's going to make sense to the reader as well. So you're practicing getting your ideas on paper, and you're practicing making your ideas make sense to a reader. So yeah, so I don't like to talk about revising or editing in the sense of checking word for word, does this work? Does this not work? Could I make it better? I don't like going through version 1 and fixing version 1. I like having version 1 and then going through a version 2 where I start over completely from scratch, and then picking out the pieces from each version that make the most sense, and then doing a pass through where I make sure it all ties together and I make sure that the grammar works and that there's no misspelled words, and that I didn't forget to end a sentence before I started the next sentence, because that happens to me a lot, especially when I'm talking. And this is where, when I get sidetracked and it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, it's really that my brain is running ahead of me. So I start and I explain the first half of an idea, but then my thoughts are already on the next idea. And so I smush them together when I'm talking, and then nothing makes sense. So if I do that, please let me know, and give me a comment, ask for explanations, clarifications. I don't do it on purpose, I promise. um, and it takes practice to remember to catch yourself from doing that, to remember to go back and look to make sure that you've made it clear. And as you do this over and over, as you repeat the process from beginning to end over and over, you get used to how you work, how your brain works, how your writing flows from your brain through your fingers to your page. Um, and you'll notice, okay, this is something I tend to do all the time, so I need to remember to check for it. One of the things that, when I was first starting to write stories down, I was doing it all by hand because I didn't have a computer yet. I was in middle school and laptops existed, but I didn't have one. So I was writing by hand, and one of the things that I would notice that I did a lot back then was I would combine the words with and the into one word, withy. Um, withy doesn't mean anything to anybody but me. I'm the only person who knows that withy means with the. Um, well, now you know too. Withy means with the. At least if I'm writing it. Um, So I would have to remember to go back and check when I was rewriting my rough draft into a cleaner version. I needed to remember to check. Did I put in a withy? And did I remember to switch that withy to a with the? Um, it's that's an element of copy editing and proofreading. But, you can do the same thing with foreshadowing, for example, where you finished your whole first draft and your ending is really cool. Then when you're going back through and you're checking everything, you want to make sure, did you put in a little detail here and there to foreshadow that ending? Did you make sure that your climax and your complication mirror each other? Did you make sure that your resolution and your inciting incident mirror each other? And it doesn't have to be an exact mirroring, it just has to make sense. It has to feel right. And if you've been reading a lot in your genre, whether you're writing nonfiction, whether you're writing academic essays, whether you're writing fantasy or science fiction or romance, you'll have a gut instinct for how to make it work, and you'll know if it feels right, you'll know. And trust yourself. Trust that gut instinct. It's important to have someone else read through your writing to make sure that it makes sense to them. Um, that's a really important part of training your own ability to trust your instinct, right? You know, this is something when I was in high school in my chemistry class, I I almost never asked questions that I didn't already know the answer to. But I asked my questions anyway because I wanted reassurance that I was on the right track. I wanted to know that I was thinking about the problem the right way. And that carries through to everything else that I do. I want feedback that tells me whether or not I'm doing something in a way that it works. I want to know that I'm getting the reaction that I'm trying to get. So I had a beta reader once read a story that I haven't published yet. Um, and I didn't give her any introduction to this story at all. I just gave her the first draft. And I wanted to see what her reaction was without any preparation, because that story is structured in a very unusual way for a fantasy novel. Um, and she wrote back to me and was furious. She she hated everything about it, but that was the purpose, that was the point. So it was really hard to read because emotionally I wanted her to like the character, I wanted her to like the story, but it didn't have an ending because of the structure and because it was the first of a series. And it's really more of a serial than anything else. And she wasn't used to serials as a concept. And I hadn't told her it was a serial. So she was mad that there was no ending. And she was mad that the structure was how it was. And this was all I got a very strong emotional response from her, which was a really great thing because I did it right. But at the same time, it was a negative response, which was what I was expecting, but it was still hard. So don't feel like you have to be happy about everything all the time. Don't take it personally when someone says, I really hated this part. You know, if they really hated that part, maybe you did a really good job there. Maybe you wrote it well enough that you got the emotional reaction that you were trying to get. Um, it's a matter of practice and feedback, and you'll get a feel for the things that you do well and that you need to work on as you practice. Um, and this goes back, so the structural editing and the planning of your novel are sort of parallel parts of the process. I do a lot of my structural editing in my planning phase because for me it's more efficient. But it also makes sure that by the time I'm done writing my story, I have a journey, I have an arc, and when I'm done, I go back and I check, did I hit all of these points? Um, so that you know when you're writing genre fiction, especially, the structure is more important than the narrative. If you have a fascinating character and a good structure, readers will enjoy your story, even if you haven't had years and years to practice writing your narrative. Um, Even if you don't feel like you've really found your voice yet, you'll still have a good story. You'll still have a story that works. You'll still be able to engage readers. Because if your characters are fascinating enough to you that you want to write a whole book about them, they will be fascinating to your readers as well. And the same goes for writing nonfiction or memoir or an essay. If you have a good structure there, then people will be able to follow your thought process as you go from one idea to the next. And they'll understand how you're putting all the pieces together, even if you're using simple language, even if you haven't practiced writing essays over and over. Um, It'll still be understandable, it'll still be clear, and people will still be able to understand why you felt that this was important enough to write about. Um, so I think it's a good place to start because it gives you a guidepost for every step through your writing process. And it makes things, more it helps you to focus so that you don't get lost as you're wandering through. Um, and it gives you a framework to really be creative. If you know what's going to happen in your scene, then instead of, a lot of people who don't like outlining because they say that it takes the creativity out. And I actually don't think that that's true. I think when you have your outline in place, whether you're doing it as a traditional outline or you're using the storyboard and beats or any combination, when you have that structure already set up before you start writing, it gives you the freedom to be creative with your use of language and to explore different points of view from what you're typically used to, what comes naturally to you, and it gives you a chance to practice finding your voice, finding your style. Sometimes you want to be writing from your own voice, but sometimes you want to be writing from the voice of your character, and that can be very different. I'm about to start on a story that is written in first person, And it's first person from my character's point of view and not from my point of view. And that's going to be a challenge for me. I'm going to have to rewrite a lot. And I'm doing a very thorough storyboard and beats combination for that story because I know I'm going to need to do a lot of rewriting, and I want to make sure that I don't get lost, that I keep the story moving in a direction that makes sense to the reader, that where it's going to have a lot of twists and turns in it because it's got a lot of elements of mystery and thriller. Um, but I want my readers to stay with me for all of those twists and turns, and so I want to make sure that I have the structure to support my ability to be creative in the narrative. Um, it's I had an English teacher in middle school who gave us the assignment to write our own Shakespearean sonnets, and they didn't really necessarily have to be Shakespearean. They just had to follow the same structure that a Shakespearean sonnet does. The same length for the lines and the same rhyming scheme. And she said that it's important to be able to be creative within a fixed structure so that you can be creative without a fixed structure. And I really, really think that that holds true. I know it does for writing the argumentative essay style um, articles, because I spent 4 years in high school struggling to write short papers using that fact funnel structure. But by the time I was in college, I didn't need to do any planning. I didn't need to do any rewriting. I could just start and go and be done. Um, I had internalized that structure and I'd practiced it enough that as soon as I knew in my head what I was trying to argue, where I was going with it, I could just do it, and I didn't have to worry about it. And I could use the structure, or I could use a different structure um, to be effective in my writing, regardless. Um, and I think that's one of the values for writing articles. If you're trying to do nonfiction, if you're doing nonfiction, it probably makes a lot of sense to look at the fact funnel structure and start writing some blog posts that fit that structure that are shorter. It doesn't have to be crazy long. You don't have to be super profound with every single thing you write. You just need to do it a lot and practice. And then by the time you're done, you'll understand how to put all of those pieces together into a book in a way that makes sense, because maybe the blog post you did first led you to an idea for the second one, but then the third one you did really should go before the first one because there was some background stuff that you needed to do. And in the same way, this can be true for novels. I have a series called the Intrigue series, and I was mentioning this in the last episode, in the last interview episode with Brian. And that series, I started planning out that series from what I thought was book one, but it's really book four. And when I was plotting out books one, two, and three for that series, I realized that there were three books that happened earlier in the series, and I needed to write those books, and I needed those books to be published first. Um, because while you could start reading from book four, it's really going to make a lot more sense if you read book one first. There's a lot of background for the characters in book four are the grandchildren of the characters in book one, and it really makes much more sense. You understand the complexities of the political dynamics and the cultural dynamics much better if you start with book one than if you start with book four. So you could start with book four, but it'll make more sense if you start with book one. And because I was doing the storyboarding and the planning, um, I realized that I needed to focus on writing the rough draft for book one before I spent too much time writing book four. So I didn't, at this point, I have more words written for book one than I do for book four. So I don't feel like I'm waiting to publish something just to get the prequels out. I'm actually writing each book primarily in order because I have this timeline for when they need to be published, and I know from my structure what order to put them in. And it also, when you have a structure or when you're practicing your finding your voice, you can write little short stories that happen outside of the structure of your novel, and you can publish those short stories as you go, and that can help you find your voice as well. When you see someone whose first novel is a huge success, it's very likely that they have been practicing through writing articles or short stories before they publish that, and they've most likely built themselves an audience through their short stories and their short works, and they've really developed their own style, their own voice through that as well. So all of this fits together, and you can use your structure to write something short. You can use your structure to write something long in a bunch of short pieces. Um, and you can use your structure to write multiple versions of something and then combine those and weave them all together. Um, and that really, it really helps just keep yourself on track. When you're trying something out and it doesn't feel right and it doesn't work, I like to use the I have this binary sort of test. Does it make me feel stressed out, or does it make me feel relieved when I am approached with a new idea, or I want to try something out, I want to experiment with something? Does it make me feel better, or does it make me feel worse? Um, and I use that as a sort of a guidepost, to pick and choose what I experiment with. Um, so I would really recommend using that guiding post. Does it make you feel stressed or does it make you feel relieved, to experiment with different styles of structure, whether you're using an outline or a storyboard or beats or just some pictures, or you draw a star and you write in at the point of each star the major thing. Um, there are so many different ways you can do this, and I've only covered what I do because that's what I know best. Um, the interview episodes, a lot of them are about writing and how individual authors do this as well. So those are good places to get ideas from. Um, but it's really about practicing. And it's helpful sometimes too, to if you have trouble practicing and you feel like it's a waste, it can be really really motivating to find someone who's willing to be your mentor, who's willing to read what you have and give you feedback and pointers. Um, and I like what Brian said in this week's interview as well. He mentioned finding an author whose style you really like, someone you admire, and finding out what their method is and emulating them. But it also could be a good idea to find an author whose style you really like and reaching out to them and asking them if they're willing to be your mentor. Seeing what they do, talking to them, getting their feedback, and having them keep you motivated and keep you on task to doing your rehearsals of your little pieces. You write a version one, you write a version two, you send them the version one while you're writing the version two, they get back to you on version one, you send them version two while you think about how you want to combine them. It keeps you on task, it keeps you motivated, it keeps you moving forward so that you're continually improving and you're continually getting finished stories, whether they're short stories or full novels. It doesn't help to have practice if you're not going to finish. Um, and finishing can be really, really tough, especially if you get sidetracked in the middle, which happens to me a lot. Um, I have a lot of trouble with the middle and with discovering that I don't actually know how a scene goes. Um, And once I get sidetracked and discouraged, then sitting down to actually write out the rough draft becomes an impossible challenge. Um, that's where resistance for me is the strongest, is as soon as I have something that I don't know in the middle. Um, so that was when I decided to do Watch Me Write. um, when I decided to do that, that was a huge relief thing on the on the stress relief spectrum. That was a relief for me, and that's not going to be true for most people. Um, so check and see what's what's giving you a feeling of relief, a feeling of, oh, okay, now I can do this, and it makes you excited, and it's reducing resistance. Um, and in a lot of ways, using the structure can help you overcome that resistance. When you know what you're writing about, then you don't need to be inspired, because you already are. You already know what you're going to do. And you can start by just writing down the facts, and you can embellish it later. Um, there's so many different ways of approaching this, but I think you get the point already. So I will be back next week. Remember, you can always ask questions in the free writer community. The links are in the show notes, but it's also abyssinianbooks.com/writers will get you there as well. And when you join the free writers group, you will get the PDF downloads for the Story Star and the Fact Funnel if you want to use those in more detail. And I'll link in the show notes as well to um, the more in-depth explanation of the Story Star and the Fact Funnel. I've got some good examples in there. So I hope to see you in the community, and I hope that you get inspired from this. I want to know what you're experimenting with, what works for you, what doesn't. Yeah, come hang out in the writers community. All right, I'll see you next time.